Okay, so this time we're going to start applying the ethics and politics of the middle way. We're going to be looking at a series of issues. And the first of those issues, which I'm taking on, is climate change. And after that, we will have some other people tackling other issues. Okay, but I'm going to start looking at climate change in relation to the middle way by talking a bit about feedback loops, which is an aspect of systems theory, one that I've used a fair amount in talking about the middle way. So I think systems theory has a huge amount to contribute to our understanding of the middle way. You may have heard of feedback loops in the environmental science of climate change, and I will be mentioning those. But feedback loops also come into the psychology of the middle way and how we distinguish what's going on when we absolutize to what's going on when we manage provisional states of judgment, where we're able to modify what we judge. So yeah, first of all, I'm going to share a diagram of reinforcing feedback loop and a balancing feedback loop. You could also call these closed and open feedback loops, or positive and negative feedback loops, though I find people often get confused by the positive negative terminology, so I've rather given this up now. So a reinforcing feedback loop is one where we're caught in a relationship between a belief, and by belief I mean a whole set of assumptions, even if you don't make them explicit, the way you act, the view of the world you assume, and then thus the information you select to fit that view of the world. So getting stuck in a reinforcing feedback loop is what it means to absolutize, to get stuck, as it were. Just think of hating somebody, for example. You get stuck in a rut thinking this person is hateful, and then you select the hateful features that you experience to reinforce your view of them. But then the balancing feedback loop is where you are actually capable of modifying that loop. We don't get rid of the loop altogether. We can't just start from scratch, but we do modify a belief as we go by allowing new information in, and that's related to the role of the right hemisphere in relation to the left, bringing in the Ian McGilchrist stuff, which I think can help us to understand the middle way. That the middle way involves being open, being provisional, so that we can change our beliefs in response to new information. So imagine there's the person you hate, for example. They're suddenly nice to you. You don't block that out. You actually allow that to modify what you think of them. Okay, so this is relevant not only to the ways we think and the difference between absolutization and the middle way, but also, of course, to non-organic things, as is often discussed in systems theory. In fact, probably its non-organic application is more common in systems theory. So you could apply it in physics or economics or environmental science or all sorts of places. Wherever you get a non-organic loop, it's just a causal loop where one kind of thing carries on causing the same sort of effect, and it creates an amplifying process. So whatever it is, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it gets out of control and it gets totally out of step with its environment, and then eventually it crashes. So I think maybe Trump's presidency is springing to mind as an example of that. Actually, that's not non-organic. Yeah, obviously there's a lot of climate change stuff we could talk about there, which I will come to in a minute. The balancing loops, on the other hand, also non-organically. So a non-organic example of a balancing feedback loop would be, say, a thermostat. It's just adapting to new information. It's a new temperature, so the thermostat changes the amount of heating it pumps into your house. So when you've got a balancing feedback loop, you maintain a stable system, and the system is in reasonable stability in relation to other systems. Okay, now if we think about our relationship with the Earth, it seems clear to me that that relationship can't be completely balanced, in the sense that we are, well, we have this drive, which comes, I think, from our overdominant left hemispheres, which it does allow us to adjust to a certain extent, but basically our approach is to adjust our environment to suit us. That's what humans tend to do a lot of the time. So although we can impact our environment to a greater or lesser extent, it seems we're always going to make it hit us in some ways. So I'm a bit dubious as to whether we can ever actually get into a complete, what in systems theory is called homeostasis, a completely balanced relationship to the Earth, whereby we're part of a self-adjusting, indefinitely sustainable system. Maybe if we go back far enough into our ancestry, we were like that, maybe in the Paleolithic, but whether we can be like that now, I don't know. But even if we can't manage to get back into that kind of balanced state in relation to everything else, at least I think we can get closer to it, so we can adjust in response to what happens around us. So that's what the middle way is about, I think. So the middle way is not the same as homeostasis, but the middle way helps to get us closer to, well, a bit closer to homeostasis, so closer to a balanced scenario. So by being balanced ourselves, by allowing new information to modify how we judge things, we can help to make the wider system, our whole relationship to the Earth and to society, more balanced or closer to balance. But yeah, even that modest kind of adjustment is obviously threatened by climate change. So climate change is on a whole new scale, as I see it, in terms of the issue with us in relation to our environment. So I'm not going to give you a lot of information about it. I'm going to assume that you actually probably know something about it, or if you don't, you can look it up. But I will just share another diagram, which I did also provide on the post on the website about this session. So this is a rather complicated diagram that I attempted to produce a few years ago now, just to illustrate some of the loops at work in climate change. And what I was trying to do, which I haven't seen done elsewhere here, is not just to illustrate the physics and the environmental science, of which I am no expert, but to try and add in psychology and consider the human effects of climate change, and how those also consist of loops of closed or reinforcing feedback loops, and how we can understand that as absolutization. Yeah, that is absolutization that the middle way is trying to avoid. That's the basis of the problem. So let's look at, just pull out one or two examples here. So if you look at the light blue section towards the top left there, there's a little reinforcing feedback loop of melting ice caps, reduced reflection from the sun, and global warming. So that's called the albedo effect, I believe. Yeah. So the more the ice melts at the poles, the less sunlight is reflected back into space, the more the Earth warms, and thus the more the Earth warms, the more the ice caps melt. So that's just one example of many non-organic reinforcing feedback loops around climate change. There are lots of others, and there seems to be more emerging all the time. So I just found out about one recently involving photosynthesis, that plants get stressed by more heat, which means they photosynthesize less, which means there's more CO2, which means there's more heat. So there are a great many of these. Now, well, my point in this diagram is that we add to them. So when these sorts of events impact on us psychologically, then we react with stress responses. We react with craving and anxiety, and that's more likely to lead to us making poor judgments, hasty judgments, which don't take the conditions into account, into increased absolutized thinking, and that leads to probably more bad effects. So reduces our resources for being able to respond to climate change. Okay, so I mean that diagram you can find on the website if you want to go back to it at any point. So the yeah, my point I suppose in relation to climate change overall then is that I don't think there's a balance of nature as such, but there are systems which can adjust up to a point and then they collapse. So if there is too much reinforcing feedback loop, whether it's non-organic or organic or psychological, however those feedback loops work and we're part of them, then eventually the system may collapse due to that system getting out of sync, out of harmony, too far from the rest of its environment. So it's human absolutization that continues to contribute to climate change. And as I've already mentioned, that's due to stress responses. And of course, that also has political effects. So when people vote on the basis of a stress response, a panic, then they're more likely to take less responsibility, for example, to support totalitarian uses of power, to fix their problems for them, because this is another feature of absolutization, that we look for quick fixes. It's fast thinking rather than slow, complex, difficult ways of dealing with things. And so the more power we get in society, the more conflict and repression that's likely to produce, both in society and in us as individuals. So it's a pretty dark scenario I feel that we're facing if climate change gallops ahead. All the signs I've seen, even in the last year or so, reports, is that the reinforcing feedback loops are accelerating. Yeah, so things like the melting of the Arctic ice, also the melting of permafrost, places like Siberia. Yeah, these are major ways in which a process that we started off is now working by itself and will continue apparently regardless of what we do, unless there's some other way we can intervene to stop that non-organic reinforcing feedback. Okay, so but thinking about the psychological aspect of it, our responses, our judgments, obviously the middle way I think is vital for any effective human response to climate change. So any kind of extreme reaction is just likely to create more stress, is just likely to create more poor judgment where we can't deal with all the complexity, what it is we're trying to judge. So panicking really doesn't help. But obviously the more threatening the situation becomes, the more tempting it becomes to panic. And the responses, more effective responses, whatever they are, have to work by addressing all the conditions, so being open to all conditions that we need to address. And very often I think people just focus maybe on the political or more evident environmental or political conditions and not the psychological ones, but the psychological ones are just as important. So any responses have to be psychologically feasible to be effective. And so it's not just enough for responses to make us feel better. So the forms I see absolutization taking in relation to climate change, and this is the closest I'm going to get to sort of moral prescription here. Yes, so in accordance with the error focus in middle way philosophy, I'm just going to try and highlight what I think are some absolutizations we're likely to fall into. I'm not going to say we should do this. I'm going to suggest these are things we could try and avoid. So I think one way that people tend to absolutize in relation to this is by piling all responsibility in one way and not another, say. So when it's a complex process, there's lots of different causes contributing to it. We might, for example, say, well, this is all politicians' fault, or this is all individuals' fault here. But obviously they interact, they're part of a system that are codependent. So I would suggest both what we do and what governments do is important, maybe not in exactly the same proportions. Then there's strategy. You know, what's the best strategy? What's the best thing to do in response? And just at the basic level, obviously cutting emissions. Now there are all sorts of ways to cut CO2 and methane emissions, and we can argue about agriculture and aviation and cars and all sorts of other sources of CO2 and methane. I just suggest, well, absolutizing this issue is likely to involve maybe just pouncing on one of those and saying this is the problem. Let's stop all these people flying, and then that will fix climate change. But obviously that's not enough. It may be a small part of it, but it's not the whole picture. And I think there's a similar thing actually about cutting emissions in general versus other strategies. So other strategies include geoengineering and include adaptation. So if we can't do anything about it, can we adapt to it? If cutting emissions is not going to make enough difference, which to me seems very likely, is there something more drastic we can do? And that's where maybe I think even individual, the more middle way our responses become, the more effective they will probably be. But even if everybody had them, that may not be enough at this stage, given how much the reinforcing feedback loops are galloping ahead by themselves. So personally, I'm inclined to think that geoengineering may be required to save human society. It has many risks involved. But you could compare it to, say, a medical scenario where to save somebody's life, you have to use risky surgery or drugs of a kind that may have side effects that may be unknown and so on. Maybe we have to use that kind of analogy to think about it. But again, it's not an either-or scenario. So again, absolutization tends to impose an either-or view on things. So it's not geoengineering or cutting emissions. It could be both. And I don't think we should always interpret geoengineering proposals just as distractions from the real problem of cutting emissions. That's about charity, perhaps. So, yeah, it may be we may need some drastic solutions because climate change is a major threat on all the evidence available to us. And just to connect that, also that thought with the discussions of ethics we had earlier in this series. So I suggested that there are different ways of thinking about how we should act. So there are consequentialist ways, there are principle-based ways, there are virtue ways. And it's not that one of those ways is always right and the other's wrong. It's more that this is a toolbox of ways of thinking that we can apply to make our thinking more adequate, our judgments more adequate. And geoengineering is obviously very much consequentialist thinking. And it's quite linear. You know, it's we've got this problem, let's fix it in this way. And that way of thinking can obviously compound the problem when you're dealing with a complex system like the Earth. And that's what people are obviously afraid of with geoengineering. But I wouldn't rule it out for the same way as I wouldn't, the same reasons I wouldn't rule out consequentialist thinking generally. You know, sometimes it's necessary to to find a moral goal and realize that that's overwhelming. We've really got to make this happen. So therefore, we need to do what's necessary to make this goal met. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. It's really just a few thoughts, but obviously particularly trying to highlight the absolutizations we could get into in relation to climate change. So over to you. Any thoughts?
I'll start, Robert. I really like the two charts that you showed, especially the two feedback loops with the consideration of left and right hemisphere, which I'm interested in. And the second chart also, it's much more complicated, but is a great connection between the geoengineering issues and the psychological and political boxes that you have in yellow. I was just hearing before we started in the last hour a radio report on how the politics can backfire, and how there's a complexity also to the attempts to address this climate change problem. So one could add even more boxes here, I think, with how to address and then what consequences can come from addressing. But I think you've mapped it out very well here. The report I heard was about environmentalists attempting to save old growth forests in Oregon. I think it was in the 80s. And the laws at that time in the United States, actually the federal agency, the Forestry Service, supported the cutting down of these centuries-old trees and helped businesses to do that. And there were jobs and communities based on that logging industry. So the environmentalists realized they could connect. Well, first they tried just using their bodies, bringing people to stop, and then bringing legal suits. But the legal suits were failing in the courts, so they connected. They took another approach and realized that there was an Endangered Species Act. So if they could connect a certain species to the trees, the centuries-old trees they were trying to save, so they picked a certain species of owl. And the problem is that backfired, even though in the short term they won their cases in court and they stopped the logging of those trees. There was a kind of what was described as by the people that were actually interviewed from this community as a kind of war, where people in the community, they were either for the saving of trees or they were against them and saw the attempt to destroy their livelihoods, to reduce their income, from the logging opportunities to just, working and flipping hamburgers, one of them said, and really destroying their livelihood. And I'm sure there's many other cases. And so the focus on this saving this owl in order to save the trees backfired in a way, because for many people then, they were attacking the idea and seeing the government as intervening against them. And they were saying we should save human lives rather than this little owl species. So I find that interesting as an example of what you're exploring with this map, and the problem of, each of us individually trying to be open-minded to alternatives and not get into that feedback loop of cyclical thinking, and yet also try to find ways collectively to address the problems of feedback loops in the environment, in climate change issue. I also recently saw some videos about the melting permafrost problem. Is very scary, how once it gets to a certain level, it's unstoppable, are the predictions, and how much that's already happening. So, with the coal industry here too, there's this reactions against Biden's plan to, and the Biden administration keeps arguing that they're going to create new jobs. But of course, for many people, it means destroying their communities and their livelihoods unless they can be convinced to retrain and, have in the same location, perhaps a solar or a wind, other alternative kind of job instead of coal mining. And obviously it would be better for their health, as well as the health of the planet if they were not involved in coal mining. But if they have many generations of that tradition, I guess the middle way would be trying to appreciate the problems that arise with addressing climate change in particular situations, and trying to find the right strategies so that not only do you have short-term success like with saving those trees in Oregon, but you also don't have a long-term backfire in terms of the psychology and the politics.
Yeah. I mean, there may be several right strategies in the sense of better strategies. I think rather than trying to identify the right strategy, if we can focus on avoiding the worst strategies, which are more obvious.
I like your questions too in the website post, because you ask about panic versus avoidance. And I feel myself kind of swinging between them, feeling this urgency that we have to do something soon, and yet it's so overwhelming in complexity. What can be done? What can I do?
Yeah. I mean, I see a bit of that, I think, in the campaigns that some of them to me seem to reflect panic in that several aspects of XR seems to do so, because probably manifests itself particularly in extreme language, I think, I mean, it so happens that one of the major founders of XR, Roger Hallam, was a school friend of mine, and I've been following his output, but recently he's got into saying things like that those who fail to act effectively, particularly in politics, to prevent climate change, are murderers. So if you get into language like that, that seems to be particularly polarizing, and it's particularly it's just focusing. You can see how he justifies it, but it's through one narrow strand of thinking, if you like, which doesn't consider a lot of alternatives. And I think it's very likely just to create conflict. The more he uses that kind of language, it's not going to create a kind of unified movement that can really do much to prevent climate change.
Yeah, exactly. I would call that, melodramatic problem, that we're tempted to demonize like Trump also was demonizing, people at the border, but also those of us more on the left might be tempted to demonize too.
Yeah. Anyone else got any comments, questions?
Yeah, I think there's this complexity issue is a huge one. Just the complexity of your mapping of those issues was big. There's nothing black and white about it. And the problem also that we're not hardwired as humans emotionally to respond to a very long-term threat or something that's unfolding in very slow motion. I mean, our threat and response systems don't really work like that. Maybe that's why people like Roger Hallam are trying to accelerate it, and Greta Thunberg by these, by ramping up the ante. I mean, I think they're, in a way, they're right to do that, but probably coming from Greta is more interesting as a young person to actually feel that someone who feels that raw emotion with a kind of long-term vision. That's quite interesting. But when arguing it, I find the complexity issue is quite interesting. Like, here we are in the coldest period for 25 years in Britain talking about global warming. So that kind of doesn't have an immediate sort of resonance for people when you try and argue about it with a person on the street. But, I can say things like, I was reading, James Lovelock over 10 years ago was describing things in terms of systems. And when a system goes unstable, particularly the climate system, he said, you will be seeing more extremes of both cold and hot. And that's exactly what's happening. That the hot anomalies are outnumbering the cold anomalies by about 3-1 or 4-1. And when, I've had a bit of an electronics background as well. And when you see graphs of a system going unstable, you see this wild swing before things really start to break down seriously. The other thing is collective management of this problem. I mean, I can agree with nearly all your points, and I can't see, though, how humans collectively are going to manage it. When you look at how divided America, for instance, is over Trump, and how they have and haven't managed that whole situation, and you find a lot of people on that right wing or hard right side, they are anti-climate change, and so on. With the COVID situation, there were a lot of similarities, but things ramped up much more quickly with COVID, so people, could actually accept it. But by the time climate change ramps up much more, we might have to accept that we've gone past quite a few tipping points. And you think, okay, thanks, friends. We're going over the edge with you. You people have been lying about it deliberately. Very powerful people in powerful situations have deliberately misinformed the public for decades now. But yeah, I'm quite skeptical that humans have it within them collectively to actually make the right decisions. Another problem I see is the thing you keep mentioning about absolutizing. The problem is that's been thrown back at us who might be concerned about climate change, is that we're not absolute enough, because we're coming up with probabilities rather than definite saying, the scientists I follow are very accurate, but they have to define the risk factors in terms of probabilities. And so immediately that's thrown back in their faces saying, oh, so you're not really sure then, or you're not really certain. And that's a standard argument by the deniers. So, you can't say for sure that this is happening, but they are within the range of probabilities. They are actually very accurate, and they can define what those probabilities are to a high degree of accuracy as well. And the models aren't that bad.
Yeah.
So I'm just really sounding off here. My frustration about finding a solution. You can win the arguments in some cases, But whether politically, you know, we'll see the right sort of action done, I'm a bit more skeptical about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sweet spot or a middle way there. I think that you can use probabilistic evidence and yet be quite decisive in your response, and also on the other side not panic, and that's quite difficult. But I'm confident that that's possible, you know, because, well, we do it. But obviously, on either side, we've got problems from people who react to panic, and then also people who take advantage of probabilistic reasoning to introduce cheap skepticism, as it were, or just relativize the issue of not taking it seriously. And this seems to come back, I'm afraid, just to, well, partly to education, but also whether people have just developed the capacity to take probabilistic thinking seriously enough, to not have to snap back immediately to certainties or assume certainties, because we're not going to get them about something as complex as the Earth's system. I mean, it's, but that doesn't change the urgency of acting on the basis of acting confidently and clearly on the basis of the overwhelming weight of probabilities. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I'm just thinking about my own situation and something Mark said about switching between panic and avoidance, and that's, I often find myself doing that, and also relating to what Vijay is saying about, you know, I'm pretty skeptical really at whether we can, as a species, adapt quickly enough to this you know, very urgent situation, and just how you know, trying to manage that sense of dread and almost like a sense of grieving about what's happening, but also trying to find that middle way I'm finding difficult.
Have you found any ways of managing that sense of dread?
Avoidance. Yeah, it's like, so just, I suppose, just carrying, I mean, trying to do my bit, but you know, I haven't bought any clothes for a couple of years now, and little things like that, you know, and I was quite active before lockdown. It's interesting about XI, I agree with you about Roger Hallam, and I've taken a step back from XI. I was quite involved about a year or two ago, and but I do think that they raised awareness at that time, especially. They put, I think, along with Greta Thunberg, you know, 18 months ago, it really put the subject on the map in the UK at least, which and I think that played a part. But I do think there is I'm really looking forward to another movement, another organization that has perhaps a greater sense of balance about the issue, because I think there are a lot of people would want to get involved with something like that somewhere. I mean, I remember the Green Party, but it seems to have very little traction in the UK. So yeah, yeah, and sometimes I do, you know, sometimes I do feel a real sense of panic, especially when I think of future generations, and so this is why I come here every other Tuesday and try and bang some sense into my head.